There is a truth that few people dare to look at head on, not because it is too complex, but because it touches on something very intimate, something that we have kept hidden deep within ourselves for a long time. It is the truth about how we relate to our own lives, to others, to the circumstances that surround us, reina. And that truth, when we finally understand it, does not strike like a lightning bolt that destroys, but like a light that gently but definitively illuminates everything that previously remained in the dark. The question I want to ask you today is simple in form, but profoundly revealing at its core. Have you ever stopped to think about the place from which you act in your own life? I am not referring to the physical place, nor the social place, nor the place that others assign to you. I am referring to the inner place from which you make your decisions, from which you respond to situations, from which you relate to those around you. Because there are people who act from a place of scarcity, from fear, from the need for approval, from the urgency to be seen and recognized. And there are people who act from a completely different place, a place where they no longer need to prove anything, where they no longer expect the world to confirm their worth, where it's its natural and profound dignity that the world inevitably presents in a completely different way. Think for a moment about the people you admire the most. Not necessarily the most famous, not necessarily the most successful by conventional standards. The people who, when they enter a room, something subtly changes in the atmosphere. The people who, when others speak, listen not out of obligation, but out of something they don't quite know how to define. The people for whom you feel, almost without understanding why, a natural respect and an attraction that has nothing to do with looks or titles or money. What is it about these people that makes them different? What is the invisible quality that sets them apart? Let me share with you something I've come to understand after years of observing and studying human nature. What sets these people apart is not what they have, but the way they inhabit themselves. It's the way they relate to their own lives. It is the attitude with which you present yourself to the world every day. And that attitude has a name, although sometimes we find it hard to recognize it in ourselves. It is called dignity. It is called self-respect. It is called the ability to act from the awareness of your own value, not as something that you must earn or something that depends on what others think of you, but as something that is already there, that has always been there waiting for you to recognize it yourself. There is an idea that has been with me for a long time and that I want to explore with you today in all the depth it deserves. That idea is that the world, people and circumstances tend to treat us according to how we treat ourselves. Not always immediately, not always perfectly visibly, but with a consistency that is surprising when one begins to observe it. If you relate to yourself from a place of neglect, from constant criticism, from the feeling that you are never enough, that energy is projected outward in ways that you may not consciously perceive, but that others feel. If instead you relate to yourself from a place of game, of care, from the honest recognition of your value, from the awareness that you deserve respect and love, that energy is also projected and the world responds to it in a completely different way. I'm not talking about arrogance, I'm not talking about superiority, I'm talking about something much more subtle and much more powerful. The serene awareness of your own value. Imagine for a moment two people show up to the same work meeting or the same social gathering or the same difficult conversation with someone important in their lives. The first one arrives wondering if she'll be liked, if she'll say the wrong thing, if others will judge her, or if she truly deserves to be there. They arrive, in a certain sense, asking for permission to exist in that space. The second arrives thinking about how they can contribute to what they have to offer, how they can be fully and authentically present. They don't need permission to be there because they already know that their presence has value. How do you think others perceive each of these people? How do you think they react to them? What kind of conversations, opportunities, and relationships do each of them attract? The difference is not in their resume, their clothes, or their social standing. The difference is in the inner place from which each one operates. And that inner place is something we can cultivate, that we can choose, that we can transform. I remember someone I met a few years ago who taught me a lesson that still resonates with me very strongly. She was someone who had gone through very difficult circumstances, significant losses, moments of profound vulnerability. And yet, when you looked at her, when you spoke to her, there was something about her way of being that generated immediate respect. A sense that you were in the presence of someone who knew herself with uncommon honesty and depth. One day I asked her how she had achieved that serenity, that particular way of being in the world. And she told me something I never forgot. She told me, I reached a point where I understood that no one was going to give me the permission I was waiting for. I understood that I had to give myself permission to be who I am, to occupy the space that my life deserves. And then the day I made that decision, everything began to change. Not the world, not the circumstances. Everything began to change because she changed. Her choices changed, her responses to situations changed, the way others related to her changed. And here is something important that I want us to consider together. There is a very common confusion that is worth undoing, and that is the confusion between acting from one's own value and expecting that value to be constantly validated by others. These are two completely opposite attitudes, although sometimes they seem similar on the surface. When we act from the expectation of external validation, we are actually acting from a place of scarcity, from the belief that our value is something we do not yet possess, something that we need to receive from outside in order to feel it inside. And that waiting creates a very particular dynamic. It makes us vulnerable to any sign of rejection. It causes us to modify who we are in order to fit the expectations of others. It causes us to seek in relationships not a genuine encounter between two people, but a source of confirmation that we are valuable. When instead we operate from our own worth, external validation, the external validation becomes something nice to have when it comes, but not something we need to function. And interestingly, when we stop needing it desperately is when it tends to come more naturally, because people are drawn to those who don't need them in their way. Because there's something about emotional self-sufficiency that almost automatically generates respect and attraction. Let me tell you about something I see a lot that I think is one of the biggest obstacles to people getting to that place of dignity that we're talking about. That obstacle is called the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, we all carry a narrative inside us, a kind of script that we begin to write from a very young age, based on the experiences we have, on what others have told us about who we are, on the conclusions we have drawn about the world and our place in it. And many times, that script includes does that convince us that we are not that enough, that there is something in us that needs to be corrected before we deserve to be treated with respect and love, that we must earn a mana players that is already ours simply by existing. Think for a moment about the phrases that you repeat yourself when no one else is listening. The phrases that appear when you make a mistake, when you do not get the result you expected, when someone treats you in a way that hurts you. From where do you speak to yourself? From where do you speak to yourself? From a place of compassion or condemnation? From a place of understanding or relentless criticism? Because the way we speak to ourselves is the foundation of everything else. It is impossible to act with dignity outwardly if we treat ourselves inwardly as if we do not deserve it. Perhaps you have never stopped to consider this in this depth. And if so, it seems to that there is a very valuable invitation here. The invitation to honestly and compassionately review the script that you carry with you, with you. Identify the chapters that no longer serve you, those that were useful at one time but that now limit you, those that perhaps were never true but that you adopted as your own because they came from people or circumstances that had a lot of weight in your life at that time. And from that honest review, begin to write a different script. Not an idealized one, Not one that ignores the difficulties or mistakes of the past, but one that recognizes you for who you truly are. A human being in the process of growth, with lights and shadows, with strengths and areas for development worthy of love and respect. Not in spite of all that, but including all that. There is a metaphor that I really like when I think about this topic. Think about how light behaves. Light does not ask permission to illuminate a space. It doesn't question whether it deserves to be there. It doesn't wait for the space to confirm its value before it shines. It just does it with total ease, with total consistency, regardless of whether or not anyone is there to appreciate it. And the result is that where there is light, darkness simply cannot remain. Not because light fights against darkness, not because light demands that darkness go away, but because the nature of light is such that darkness cannot coexist with it. That is exactly what happens when a person acts from an awareness of their own worth. They don't need to fight against disrespect. They don't need to demand that others treat them a certain way. Their very presence, the way they inhabit themselves, creates a space where disrespect simply cannot settle. Because when someone knows who they are, when they act from that place of inner certainty, there's something about that person that communicates without words. This is who I am. This is what I offer. This is what I accept, and this is what I don't. And others perceive it. Others respond to that clarity. But I want to be honest with you about something, because I believe honesty is always more helpful than easy promises. Getting to that place doesn't happen overnight. It's not the result of a one-time decision, a book you read, a lecture you listened to. It's the result of a process. A process that has its moments of progress and its moments of regression. And it's days when everything seems clear, and it's days when we fall back into old patterns, old stories, old automatic responses that we work so hard to turn off. And that's okay. That's part of the human process. The key is not to be perfect in that process. The key is to stick with it. The key is to use each time we fall back into the old pattern, instead of using it as evidence that we are irredeemable, to use it as information, as an opportunity to understand ourselves better, to identify what circumstances or emotions are bringing us back to that place, and to practice a different response with patience and compassion. Let me share a little bit more about what it means to act from one's dignity, because I want to make sure that we are talking about the same thing, that we're not confusing this concept with something it's not. Acting from dignity doesn't mean acting from a place of coldness. It doesn't mean closing your heart so as not to be hurt. It doesn't mean building walls that keep others at a safe distance. Quite the contrary. Those individuals who truly act from this place of awareness, and to be deeply open, deeply capable of love, and also deeply generous when it comes to their relationships. Precisely because they don't need to protect themselves defensively, they can open up genuinely. They can give without constantly calculating whether they're going to get something in return. They can be vulnerable without that vulnerability becoming a trap. The difference is that openness, that generosity, that vulnerability doesn't come with the fear of losing something that's not guaranteed. It comes with the inner certainty that regardless of a world response, regardless of whether that openness is reciprocated or not, they are still who they are. Their value does not depend on the outcome. And here we come to something that seems fundamental to me in all this reflection, the relationship between the limits we establish and the respect we receive. There is a very common illusion that consists of believing that setting limits is an act of harshness, selfishness, and lack of love. However, the reality is completely the opposite. Limits are actually one of the most loving acts that exist, both towards oneself and towards others. Because when we do not have clear limits, when we allow our energy, our time, and our attention to be used in ways that do not nourish us or that directly harm us, we are not being generous. We are being negligent. We are being negligent with ourselves. And that negligence has consequences. It generates resentment, exhaustion, and the feeling that life takes more from us than it gives. But even more important for what we are talking about today, when we do not have clear limits, we are communicating to others without words, but with total clarity that we do not value ourselves enough to protect what matters. And others, consciously or unconsciously, take that information and act accordingly. Think of someone who consistently accepts deals that hurt them, who never says no even when it costs them enormous amounts of energy and well-being, who is always there for everyone but themselves. How do others perceive them? With more or less respect. The answer, as painful as it may be, is almost always the same. Others end up perceiving that person as someone who can be used, not because they are bad people, not because they consciously choose to exploit them, but because the message that person sends with their actions is, I don't care enough about myself to take on the vidnar of myself. And the world tends to believe us. The world tends to treat us according to what we communicate about our own worth. Instead, think of someone who knows their own boundaries and holds them calmly and without drama, who can say no respectfully but firmly, who guards their energy, time, and attention as the precious resources that they are. How do others perceive them? What kind of relationships do they attract? What treatment do they get? The difference is striking, and it's no coincidence. And here is something important, worth clarifying. Setting boundaries does not mean setting up barriers. Boundaries are like the banks of a river. They are not there to stop the water, but to give it direction, to allow it to flow meaningfully. A river without banks is not a free river. It is a river that becomes a swamp, that loses its strength, that can no longer go anywhere. In the same way, a life without clear boundaries is not a more open or generous life. It is a life that loses its direction, that is scattered among a thousand obligations that no one asked for, but that no one dared to reject either. Boundaries well established, maintained from dignity and not from fear, are what allow love to flow in a real and sustained way. They are what allow relationships to be true encounters between two people who respect each other, not relationships where one gives completely and the other takes without limit. Let me now talk to you about an aspect of off-taste that is often overlooked, the role that consistency plays in the way others perceive and treat us. There are people who in certain contexts act with dignity and in other contexts abandon it completely. They are strong at work but lose it in emotional relationships. Or they are careful with themselves in private but let themselves be trampled on in social or professional settings. And this inconsistency, this fragmentation, generates confusion in others that in the long run is costly, because others do not know exactly who they are dealing with. They do not know if they are going to find the confident and clear person or the anxious and needy person. And in the face of this uncertainty, they tend to relate to the most vulnerable version, the version that leaves them the most space to move as they see fit. Consistency, on the other hand, generates trust. When we act from dignity consistently, regardless of the context of the interlocutor or the circumstances, we send a clear and sustained message about who we are. And that consistent message that generates lasting respect, that builds true relationships, that attracts circumstances that are in tune with who we truly are. Imagine for a moment what it means to live from that coherence. Imagine that the same people you show yourself to be in private are the same ones who show up in public. That the person you treat with love and care when you are alone with yourself is the same person you present to the world. That there is no painful gap between who you think you are on the inside and who you show on the outside. That integration, that inner unity is one of the most liberating experiences there is. Because when we are coherent, when we do not need to maintain different versions of ourselves in different contexts, we stop wasting energy on fragmentation. And that energy is freed up for what really matters. Matter does us. Growing, creating, loving, contributing. And others feel that freedom even if they can't always name it. They feel that they are in front of someone real, someone they can trust, someone whose presence has weight and solidity. There is a story that I want to tell you because I think it illustrates very well everything that we have been exploring together. A while ago, I heard about a teacher who taught in a small community in very modest material circumstances. She had no resources, no social recognition, and no credentials that usually impress others. And yet the students who attended her classes remember her decades later as one of the most influential people in their lives. One of those students, now an adult, was asked what had left the greatest impression on him about that teacher. And the answer was surprising in its simplicity. She never treated us as if we were less than we were. But she never treated herself as less either. There was something in the way she stood before the world, in the way she made her decisions, not to be less without her saying so explicitly that you can be in any circumstance and still be who you are, that circumstances can take many things away from you, but they can't take that away from you. That thing that doesn't have an easy name, but that we all recognize when we see it, that presence that comes from within, that doesn't depend on what the world gives or takes away. That is ultimately the only truly indestructible thing you have. And here I want to pause and ask you something directly. How many times in your life have you given that away? How many times have you allowed circumstances, the comments of others, the difficulties or failures to convince you that you were lesser than who you really are? I don't ask you this to make you feel guilty. I ask you this because I believe that there is enormous liberation in honesty, in recognizing with compassion, with judgment, but without self-deception, the moments in which we abandon ourselves. Because in those moments, most of the time, it wasn't reality that limited us. It was the story we chose to believe about reality. It was the interpretation we put on the facts. It was the hasty conclusion that if something went well for us, it's because something in us was fundamentally broken. And that conclusion, when we adopt it, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if we believe we are broken, and we act on the place, and the world responds to that place, and we have more evidence that the conclusion was correct, the cycle perpetuates until something or someone helps us see that the conclusion was false, that what happened was not evidence of our worthlessness. It was simply what happened with all its weight and pain, but without the added burden of the additive we put on top of it. I want to talk to you now about something that I find deeply valuable on the path to that way of being in the world, and that is sometimes underestimated. The power of small, everyday acts of self-respect. We tend to think that to transform transformation requires big events, big decisions, big visible changes. And while those moments have their importance, the truth is that identity is built, above all, on the small, the everyday, the seemingly insignificant, on whether you choose to rest when your body is asking for rest, or whether you push beyond your limits out of habit. Whether you say what you think honestly, or you keep them quiet to avoid conflicts that deep down you find increasingly difficult to sustain. Whether you allow yourself to feel what you feel, or you force yourself to present a numb version of yourself because you believe that your emotions are too much, that they are an inconvenience to others. Whether you take care of the quality of the thoughts that you let inhabit your mind, or you allow any story, no matter how destructive, to settle there without questioning it. Each of these small gestures is a vote that you give to the version of yourself that is known and respected, or a vote that you give to the version that is unknown and neglected. And the votes accumulate. Over time, the sum of these daily votes is what determines from which place you inhabit your own life. Think for a moment about the difference between someone who wakes up every morning and before going out into the world takes a few moments to connect with themselves, to recognize what they feel, to set an intention about how they want to be that day, to remember who they are beyond the roles and obligations, ukali. And someone who wakes up every morning in automatic mode, who is immediately immersed in external demands, who goes through the day reacting to what the world throws at them without any moment of inner grounding. Both people will face the same day, the same challenges, the same opportunities, but they will do so from completely different places. And that changes everything. The decisions they make, the relationships they build, the experiences they generate, the feeling with which they end the day, not because one is a better person than the other, but because one has taken the time to build that inner foundation from which to act, and the other has not yet discovered that that foundation is possible and that it is up to them to build it. And I also want to talk to you about fear, because it would be dishonest not to, because fear is there in this process. The fear of being judged if you of others not recognizing the new version of you and continuing to relate to the old one. The fear of losing connections that were based on a dynamic that no longer serves you, but that at least felt familiar. The fear of giving yourself permission to be who you are and discovering that that's not enough for others. The fear is of making mistakes in the process, of your boundaries being misunderstood, of your new way of being in the world generating rejection instead of the respect you seek. All of these fears are real, and I'm not going to tell you that they'll magically disappear the moment you make the decision to change who you want. They don't. What changes is your relationship with them. What changes is whether you obey them blindly or whether you acknowledge them, understand them, and still decide to act from a place more aligned with who you are. Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision to act from your values even when fear is present. And every time you do that, every time you acknowledge the fear and take the step anyway, something grows stronger in you. Something that over time becomes that way of being in the world that others perceive as security, as presence, as a type of authority that doesn't need to be imposed because it simply is. Let me share one final with you before we come to the end of this meeting, and that is about the relationship between how you treat yourself and how you treat others. Because there is something that I have consistently observed, and that I believe is one of the most important truths about human nature. People who treat themselves with respect and genuine care are invariably people who treat others better. Not because they are perfect, not because they never make mistakes or never unintentionally hurt, but because there is a fundamental coherence between the way we relate to ourselves and the way we relate to the world. When I take care of myself, when I respect myself, when I treat myself with the same compassion that I would give to someone I love, I have more to give. Not from a place of sacrifice, not from a place of obligation, but from a place of abundance, from a place where giving does not drain me, but rather in some way fulfills me, buzz me. And when we live from that place, relationships change in nature. They cease to be exchanges where one gives and the other takes. Become real encounters between two people who know who they are and who choose to be together from that knowledge, not from a desperate need to fill a void that deep down only they themselves can fill. And so at the end of everything we've gone through together today, I want to ask you once more, but now in a different way. From what place do you want to act in your life? From the waiting for someone to give you the permission that only you can give yourself? From the need for the world to confirm a value that already exists within you, that was always there, that does not need to be earned but recognized, or from that the deeper, more serene, more yours place where you know who you are, even if the world does not always confirm it, where you act from your values, even if the path is not always easy, or where you treat yourself with the same dignity and the same love with which you expect to be treated. Because life, in its profound wisdom, gives us exactly what we are capable of sustaining. No more, no less. And learning to hold ourselves with that dignity, with that care, with that full presence is not a luxury for those who have time or for those who have already arrived at some destination. It is the starting point. It is the foundation from which everything else can be built. It is the decision that is available right now in this moment, regardless of where you are or how far or close you feel to that version of yourself that you most admire. You do not have to wait to be perfect. You do not have to wait to have everything figured out. You can start now with the small gesture of recognizing that you have value, that value does not have to be earned, and that the way the world treats you begins always with the way you choose to treat yourself. That is what it means to act from the awareness of who you are. That is what it means to inhabit yourself with dignity. And that in the end is the only thing that changes everything else.